hit subscribe, and join our growing community. Now, here's what happened. The teller at the Fifth Third Bank branch on Camelback Road in Phoenix slid my debit card back across the counter and said, in the gentlest voice a 22-year-old has probably ever used on a 53-year-old woman, "Ma'am, this account was closed 11 days ago." I asked her to run it again. She did. Same answer. I asked her to check the joint savings account too, the one Walter and I had kept since 1996, the one that still had our wedding date written in the memo line of the very first deposit slip, because some habits you keep even after you've forgotten why you started them. She typed for a moment, then looked up at me with an expression I'd start seeing a lot over the next several weeks. The look of someone who has information they're not allowed to give you and knows exactly how much that's about to hurt. That account shows a zero balance, ma'am. It was emptied the same day. 30 years of marriage, and I found out it was overstanding at a bank counter with a grocery list still folded in my purse. Before I tell you what happened next, I'm Sarah, and you're watching Beyond Truth Revealed. Hit subscribe and join our growing community. Now, here's what happened. I want to be specific about the date because dates matter in this story more than almost anything else. It was a Tuesday in March. I'd come to the bank to pay the water bill, because the water bill is the one bill Walter always let me handle, the small domestic task he'd waved off years ago as your department, the same way I'd waved off the taxes and the investment accounts as his. 30 years of dividing a marriage into departments, and it turned out I'd been quietly assigned the department with no actual power in it at all. I called Walter from the parking lot. It went straight to voicemail. I called his office. He's a regional sales director for a medical supply company headquartered out of Scottsdale, has been for 19 years, the kind of job with a company car and a pension he used to talk about like it was a sure thing, like security itself. And his assistant, a young woman named Brittany who'd always been perfectly polite to me at the Christmas parties, told me Walter had taken an early retirement package 2 weeks earlier. 2 weeks. He'd retired 2 weeks earlier and hadn't mentioned it once. I drove home to the house on Shawla Street, the house we'd bought in 1998 with money my mother left me when she passed, the house where I'd raised our 2 children, Daniel and Marisol, both grown now, both living out of state, and I sat in the driveway for almost 20 minutes before I went inside, because some part of me already understood that whatever I found inside that house was going to be different from what I'd left that morning. It wasn't. The furniture was the same. The photographs were still on the mantel. Walter's reading glasses were still on the nightstand on his side of the bed. Everything looked exactly the way it had looked for years, which was somehow worse than finding it ransacked, because it meant nothing about the house itself had changed. Only the paperwork underneath it had. My name is Sarah Whitcomb. I'm 53 years old. I worked as a dental hygienist for 26 years at a practice on Indian School Road before my hours got cut back 5 years ago when the practice changed ownership. And I never quite found full-time work again, partly because the new owners brought in younger staff, partly because Walter had told me, gently, reasonably, that we didn't really need the income anymore at this point, that his salary and his coming pension were more than enough, that I should take the time, enjoy it, finally rest after raising 2 kids and working full-time for over 2 decades. I believed him. I had no particular reason not to. We weren't a couple who fought about money. We were a couple who simply didn't discuss it, which I now understand is a very different thing, and a far more dangerous one. I went through the desk in the den that evening, the one Walter used for what he called the business of the house. Bills, taxes, the safe deposit box key, documents I'd signed over the years without ever asking many questions, because that had always been his department, and I'd trusted him the way you trust a roof over your head. Without checking the shingles. The desk drawer that usually held our joint financial folder was empty. not disorganized. Empty the way a drawer looks after someone has deliberately cleared it. Wiped clean, nothing left behind by accident. I found one thing, though, tucked into the back corner, where it must have slipped behind the drawer's runner and gotten missed. A business card. Crisp white cardstock, raised black lettering. Daryl Hutchins, Esquire, Hutchins and Cole Family Law, Tempe, Arizona. On the back, in Walter's handwriting, a date from 4 months earlier, and 3 words I read maybe a dozen times standing there in the den with the desk lamp, throwing a small yellow circle of light across the empty drawer. Asset protection. Confirmed, 4 months. He had been seeing a divorce lawyer for 4 months, moving money for who knows how long before that, closing accounts, taking early retirement, and not once. Not at dinner, not in bed, not in the car on the way to his sister's birthday in February, had Walter Whitcomb given me a single sign that any of it was coming. I called Daniel that night. He didn't answer either. I sat at the kitchen table where I'd made breakfast for this family for 30 years, holding a business card for a lawyer I'd never heard of. In a house that still looked exactly the same, belonging to a woman who suddenly understood she might not legally own a single thing inside it. I didn't know yet that the very mistake that would eventually save me was already sitting in a filing cabinet in Tempe, made months before I even knew there was anything to be saved from. Part 2. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. Around 11, Daniel finally called back, his voice careful in a way that told me before he said a single word that he already knew something I didn't. Mom, where are you right now? Home. Where else would I be? A pause, the kind that costs something to sit through. Dad called me last week. He said he and I should talk soon, that there were some changes coming, that he didn't want me to be blindsided. Daniel's voice cracked slightly on the word blindsided, like he'd been turning it over in his mouth for days, hating it. He never said what kind of changes, Mom. I swear to you, I asked, and he just said it was complicated, and he'd explain when the time was right. And you didn't think to call me? He asked me not to. He said you two were working through some things privately and he didn't want me adding pressure. Daniel exhaled, long and unsteady. Mom, I'm sorry. I should have called anyway. I just trusted him. That phrase, I just trusted him, was apparently going to be the theme of my entire week. Everyone around me had trusted Walter exactly as much as I had, and none of us, it seemed, had thought to ask why a 56-year-old man would suddenly need a confidentiality request that elaborate. The next morning, I drove to the Hutchins and Cole offices in Tempe without calling ahead, because I decided overnight that whatever I found there, I wanted to see Daryl Hutchins's actual face when he realized who I was. The office sat in a low brick building, off McClintock Drive, the kind of unremarkable strip of professional suites, a dentist, an insurance agency, a family law firm that you drive past 100 times without registering, until one of them holds the paperwork for the end of your life as you knew it. The receptionist, a woman in her 60s with reading glasses on a beaded chain, asked if I had an appointment. I said no, and gave her my name, and watched something flicker across her face, not recognition exactly, but the look of someone who has heard a name mentioned in a closed-door meeting and is now trying very hard not to let that show. Mr. Hutchins is with a client, she said. I can have him call you. I'd rather wait. I waited 50 minutes. When Daryl Hutchins finally came out, he was younger than I expected, maybe 45, with the kind of practiced calm that comes from doing this exact job, delivering bad financial news to blindsided spouses, presumably from both directions, for a long time. He didn't pretend not to know who I was, which I appreciated, in a strange way, even as everything else about the conversation made my hands shake. Mrs. Whitcomb, I have to be honest with you. I can't discuss the specifics of any work I've done for your husband. Attorney-client privilege. I'm sure you understand, given your own situation. I don't have an attorney, Mr. Hutchins. I have a closed bank account and an empty desk drawer, and a business card I found behind it with your handwriting on the back. So no, I don't entirely understand. Explain it to me. He sat down across from me in the small waiting area instead of inviting me into his office, which told me something too. He didn't want this conversation happening anywhere that might later be characterized as a meeting. What I can tell you, because it's public record once filed, is that your husband has not yet filed for dissolution of marriage. Nothing has been formally submitted to the court. Ade, then what has he done? I really can't say more than that, Mrs. Whitcomb. I'd strongly encourage you to retain your own counsel. Today, if possible. I want to tell you I left that office calmly. I didn't run, but I also didn't quite walk in a straight line back to my car, because something about his sentence, "Nothing has been formally submitted to the court," had landed strangely. If nothing was filed, then where had the money gone? You don't need a court filing to empty a joint account. You just need a signature and an excuse. I called my sister, Renata, in Tucson on the drive home because Renata had been divorced twice and remarried once, and had, over the years, developed the kind of practical, slightly weary expertise in family law disasters that I'd always quietly envied without ever expecting to need it myself. Sarah, slow down. Tell me again. Closed accounts. No filing yet? That's what he said. Nothing filed. Then Walter is doing something people call dissipation of assets. And depending on which state you're in, that can actually work against him later. But only if you can prove the timeline. When exactly did the accounts close? 11 days ago, the teller said. And when did he take this early retirement package? 2 weeks ago. Maybe 13, 14 days. So 2 days before he cleared the accounts. Renata was quiet for a second, the particular quiet of someone doing math she didn't want to be doing. Sarah, I need you to listen to me carefully, because I love you, and I'm about to say something you're not going to want to hear. You need a forensic look at exactly where that money went, and you need it before he has time to move it again. Banks, retirement accounts, anything with his name on it. Today, not next week. I don't even know where to start with something like that. I know someone. She did the forensic work on my second divorce, found money my ex had moved into his brother's name 8 months before he ever mentioned the word divorce out loud. Her name's Connie Park. She's expensive, but Sarah, you don't actually know yet how much there is to find. You might be underestimating what you're fighting for. I drove home past the house on Cholla Street, twice, before I finally pulled into the driveway, because I needed those extra few minutes to settle my face into something that wouldn't frighten Marisol if she called, something that wouldn't tell the neighbors anything was wrong if they happened to be out watering their lawns. I let myself into a house that still smelled like the coffee Walter had made that morning before he left for wherever he went, now that he no longer had an office to go to. And I sat down at the kitchen table with Renata's note, Connie Park, forensic accountant, Tucson, written on the back of an envelope, and I thought about the word dissipation and how strange it was that 30 years of marriage could end up being described, in the end, with a word usually reserved for fog or smoke. I called Connie Park's office before I'd even taken my coat off. Her assistant said she had an opening Thursday. I asked if anything sooner was possible, and the assistant, after a pause, said she'd check, because apparently something in my voice had told her this wasn't a woman who could wait until Thursday to find out how much of her own life was still actually hers. Part 3 Connie Park's office turned out to be a converted house off Speedway Boulevard in Tucson, the kind of place that used to be somebody's living room and now had a paper shredder where the fireplace used to sit. Renata drove down with me Thursday morning, and I was grateful for it in a way I didn't say out loud because I wasn't sure my hands would have stayed steady enough on the wheel for the whole hour and 40 minutes. Connie was maybe 60, sharp-eyed, with the unhurried manner of someone who had seen every version of this exact morning play out across her desk for 20 years and had stopped being surprised by any of it. She asked for account numbers, statements, anything I had, and I handed over a thin folder that felt almost embarrassing in its smallness. 3 months of bank statements I'd printed at the library, because Walter had always handled the online banking, a copy of our last joint tax return, and the business card from Daryl Hutchins's office. "This is a start," she said, not unkindly. "Give me a week. I'll need access to anything else you can legally access. Safe deposit box, any mail still coming to the house in his name. Anything." I drove home that afternoon and did exactly that. The safe deposit box was at the same Fifth Third branch, and the teller, a different one this time, older, more careful with her face, informed me that Walter had removed himself as a cosigner and changed the access list 2 months earlier. I hadn't been to that box in years. I had no idea, walking in, that I'd already been quietly removed from it. What I didn't expect, 4 days later, was a knock at the door from someone other than Connie Park, Renata, or anyone else I'd been preparing myself to face. It was Walter's sister, Joan, who I'd always liked, who'd sent me a birthday card every single year for 30 years without fail, standing on my porch on Chola Street with red eyes and a folder of her own pressed against her chest like a shield. "Sarah, can I come in? I need to tell you something before Walter does, because I don't think he's planning to tell you at all, and I can't live with that." I let her in. She didn't sit down. She stood in my living room, the same living room where she'd sat for Thanksgiving 20-some times, and she told me that Walter had been diagnosed 8 months ago with early-stage Parkinson's, that he'd told almost no one, that he'd gone to Daryl Hutchins not, as I'd assumed, purely to protect assets from me, but because, in Joan's telling, which she insisted was the truth as Walter had explained it to her, he was terrified of becoming a burden, terrified of long-term care costs eating everything we'd built, and had convinced himself that the cleanest way to protect the family's money was to quietly restructure everything into accounts and trusts that wouldn't be touchable by future medical debt, before telling me anything, because he was, in her words, ashamed and scared and doing it badly. I sat down on my own couch because my legs asked me to. A diagnosis, 8 months. The same general window as the lawyer's visit, the closed accounts, the early retirement, slotting into place with a horrible, almost merciful logic, because for one breathless moment, it meant Walter wasn't simply cruel. It meant there was a reason. Why didn't he tell me himself? I asked. Why you, and why now? Joan's face did something complicated. Because I told him I was coming here today whether he liked it or not, Sarah. He's not handling this well. I love my brother, but I think he's been getting bad advice, and I think some of it isn't really about the diagnosis at all anymore. I think somewhere in the last few months, this turned into something else. What do you mean, something else? I mean, I think there's a woman, Sarah. I don't have proof. I have a feeling, and 20 years of knowing my brother's face when he's lying about something small versus something large. I think the diagnosis is real. I also think it isn't the whole reason anymore, and I think you deserve to know that before you decide how much sympathy to extend to him. She left an hour later, her folder still pressed to her chest, having given me more honesty in 60 minutes than Walter had given me in 4 months, and I sat alone afterward trying to decide which fact to be more afraid of, that my husband had a degenerative diagnosis he hadn't told me, or that somewhere underneath that real and frightening fact, there might be an entirely different, much less sympathetic story quietly using it as cover. Connie Park called 2 days after that, sooner than her promised week, which told me before she said a word that she'd found something that couldn't wait. Sarah, I need you to sit down for this. I traced the joint savings account. $240,000, gone in 3 transfers over the last 5 months, not into any retirement account, not into anything with the word trust in the title. It went into an account belonging to a woman named Renee Castellano, in Mesa. I cross-referenced the address. It's a townhouse Walter has been quietly paying rent on for the last 7 months, under a name that isn't his. A P.O. Box LLC registered to Hutchins and Cole Holdings, which, Sarah, is not a normal thing a family law firm sets up for a client unless that client asked them to help him build something specifically designed to stay hidden. I thought of Joan's face in my living room, the careful way she'd said, "I think there's a woman," the way even she hadn't fully wanted to believe her own instinct. I thought of the diagnosis, which might be entirely real, sitting right alongside a townhouse in Mesa that was entirely, undeniably real in a completely different way. "Connie," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "I need everything you have on Renee Castellano. Today. And I need to know exactly how Hutchins set up that LLC, because if a licensed attorney structured a hidden entity to help my husband move money before any divorce was filed, I don't think that mistake is going to stay his secret for very much longer." Part 4. Connie sent over what she had on Renee Castellano within the hour, and it wasn't what I expected. I'd braced myself for a younger woman, someone glamorous, someone who fit the easy story Joan's face had seemed to suggest. Instead, I was looking at a LinkedIn photo of a woman in her late 40s, a licensed home health aide who had, according to the public records Connie pulled, been Walter's in-home care coordinator for the last 7 months, hired quietly through a private agency, not through our insurance, paid in cash for the first 2 months before the payments started routing through that townhouse account instead. "She's not the affair, Sarah," Connie said over the phone, her voice careful in a way that told me she'd seen people leap to wrong conclusions before and didn't want me to be one of them. Or at least, I can't find evidence that she is. What I can find is that Walter has been receiving regular medical care at that townhouse for months. Physical therapy equipment delivered there. A visiting neurologist's billing address matching that unit. I think the diagnosis Joan told you about is real, and I think this woman is actually treating him for it. But Sarah, that doesn't make the money trail innocent. It makes it more complicated, not less. Because somebody convinced him, or helped him convince himself, that the way to handle a real illness was to hide $240,000 from his wife of 30 years instead of simply telling her the truth. I sat with that for a long moment after we hung up, turning it over the way you turn over a stone to see what's actually living underneath it. A part of me, an old, tired, 30 years married part, wanted badly to feel relief. He was sick. He was scared. Maybe this wasn't really about erasing me at all. But the part of me that had spent 4 days reading bank statements at a library table didn't let that relief sit for very long. Because relief, I was learning, was exactly the feeling someone wanted me to have right then, and feelings that convenient are worth examining twice. It was Daniel who found the next piece. 3 days later, not Connie, not Renata, not me. He'd flown in from Denver the moment I told him about Joan's visit, sleeping on my couch on Cholla Street like he had as a teenager, and on his second night home, he sat at the kitchen table with his father's old laptop, the one Walter had left behind in the garage, apparently not thinking anyone would bother looking at a machine he considered obsolete, and found an email thread Walter had never bothered to delete between himself and Daryl Hutchins, dated 6 months back. "Mom, you need to see this." The thread wasn't about the diagnosis at all. It was about the sale of Walter's pension. Not the existence of it, the sale of it. A lump sum buyout structure Hutchins had connected him with through a third party, the kind of arrangement. Daniel explained after 20 minutes on the phone with a friend from law school that retirees sometimes use legitimately, but that can also be used to convert a court-recognized retirement asset into liquid cash that's far easier to move, hide, or spend before any divorce proceeding ever gets the chance to value it as marital property. Walter had sold 19 years of pension benefits for a lump sum 11 weeks before he ever told his own sister he was sick. "Mom, the email makes it sound like Dad came to Hutchins asking how to do this." Daniel said quietly, like he was trying to soften something that couldn't actually be softened. Not the other way around. Hutchins even wrote back at one point, and I want to read you this exact line, because I think you need to hear how careful it is. As discussed, structuring this prior to any filing minimizes characterization risk. Recommend continued discretion with spouse pending finalization. Discretion with spouse. 2 words doing the work of an entire conversation Walter had decided I wasn't entitled to have. I called Renata that night, and for the first time since this whole thing started, I heard real anger in her voice instead of just steady, practical calm. Sarah, that line, discretion with spouse pending finalization, that's not a lawyer protecting a sick man's privacy. That's a lawyer giving legal advice on how to move an asset before a spouse can claim her share of it. If that email is real and dated the way Daniel says it is, your husband's own lawyer just put something on paper that could blow this whole thing wide open, because Arizona courts do not look kindly on documented pre-filing concealment, and they look even less kindly on the attorney who advised it. What do I do with it? You don't do anything with it yet. You give it to your own attorney today, and you let them decide exactly when and how it surfaces, because timing on something like this matters more than the document itself. If Hutchins realizes that email still exists somewhere, he'll start covering for it immediately, and so will Walter. I hadn't hired my own attorney yet. I'd been so consumed by Connie's forensic trail and Joan's revelation and Daniel's discovery that I'd somehow let the most basic steps sit untouched for nearly 2 weeks. Renata gave me a name that night. A woman named Patricia Saldana, a family law attorney in Phoenix with a reputation, Renata said, for being quiet right up until the moment she wasn't. I called Patricia's office first thing the next morning. Her assistant put me through within minutes, which I would later learn was not normal, and was the first sign that something about my situation had already started moving faster than I understood. Mrs. Whitcomb, Patricia said, her voice calm but unmistakably alert, I need you to send me everything you have today, not this week. And I need to ask you something directly because it changes how fast we move. Has your husband's attorney, Daryl Hutchins, ever contacted you personally? Called you? Written you? Anything at all? No, never. There was a pause on her end, the kind that told me she was choosing her next sentence carefully. Then I think you should know that he's about to. I got a call an hour ago from a colleague who heard, secondhand, that Hutchins has been trying to reach a Sarah Whitcomb since yesterday afternoon. Mrs. Whitcomb, lawyers on the other side of a case, do not call the unrepresented spouse directly unless something has gone badly wrong on their end, and they're trying to get ahead of it before you find your own counsel. I think we may already be too late to stop that call. I just need you to not answer it without me on the line first. Part 5. The call came at 6:40 that evening, while I was standing at the stove making the same chicken and rice I'd made 100 times before, in the kitchen, where this entire thing had started 2.5 weeks earlier. I almost answered out of pure reflex. Patricia had told me to let it go to voicemail if she wasn't already on a 3-way line with me, and for once in my life I did exactly what I was told. Daryl Hutchins left a message. I played it for Patricia an hour later, both of us listening on speaker in her Phoenix office, her associate taking notes the entire time. Mrs. Whitcomb, this is Daryl Hutchins. I wanted to reach out personally because I think there's been some confusion about my role in this situation, and I'd like the chance to clear that up directly, off the record, before things get any more complicated than they need to be. I think it would really be in everyone's best interest. Walter's, yours, the whole family's. If we could speak informally, just the two of us, before any of this becomes formal, I really do think that's the best path for everyone involved. Patricia stopped the recording and looked at me, and for the first time since I'd met her, I saw something close to satisfaction cross her face. The particular satisfaction of a person watching an opponent do exactly what she'd hoped they would. Sarah, that message is a gift. An attorney representing the opposing party in a contested marital matter is not permitted to contact the other side directly once he knows that side intends to retain counsel. And he knew because word travels fast in small legal communities, and somebody clearly told him you'd called me. He just left a recorded message inviting you to an off-the-record conversation specifically designed to happen without me present. That's not just inappropriate. Depending on what he says, if you'd actually picked up, that could be the beginning of an ethics complaint that follows him for years. Why would he risk that? Because he's scared of something specific, Sarah, and I think we both know what it is. That email Daniel found. Discretion with spouse pending finalization. That's not just bad for Walter. That's a documented instance of an attorney advising a client to conceal assets from a spouse before any filing. If that surfaces in a courtroom, Hutchins isn't just losing a client's case. He's potentially looking at sanctions from the state bar. He's trying to get to you first, informally, before you understand exactly how much leverage that one email actually gives you. That night, Walter finally called me himself, for the first time since the bank counter on Camelback Road. His voice sounded smaller than I remembered it, tired in a way that had nothing performative about it. Sarah, Joan told me she talked to you. I should have told you about the diagnosis myself. I know that. I've known that for months, and I kept finding reasons to wait, and I'm sorry. I really am. I believe you're sorry about the diagnosis, Walter. I don't think I believe you're sorry about the rest of it yet. A long silence. What do you mean? The rest of it? I mean $240,000 moved into an account for a home health aide I never met. Paid for through a townhouse LLC registered to your lawyer's firm. I mean a pension you sold for a lump sum 11 weeks before you told your own sister you were sick. I mean an email from Daryl Hutchins telling you to maintain, and I'm quoting it exactly, Walter, discretion with spouse pending finalization. That's not a man protecting his privacy about an illness. That's a plan. The silence this time lasted long enough that I genuinely wondered if he'd hung up. Sarah, it started as protecting the money from medical costs. I swear to you that's how it started. I was terrified. I didn't know how fast this disease moves. I'd read horror stories about families losing everything to long-term care, and Hutchins made it sound so clean, so simple, just move things into a structure where Medicaid and creditors couldn't touch it. And then somewhere in there, I don't even know exactly when, it stopped being about protecting us and started being about protecting me from you, finding out how badly I'd already handled it. I got scared of my own mistake instead of scared of the disease, and I let the second fear make decisions the first fear should have been making. I stood in my kitchen holding the phone, the chicken long since gone cold on the stove behind me, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel in that exact moment. Not relief, not quite forgiveness, but a kind of grim clarity. Walter wasn't a monster who'd spent 30 years secretly planning my financial destruction. He was a frightened, sick man who'd let a lawyer convince him that hiding the truth was a form of protecting his family, right up until hiding the truth became the only thing he was actually protecting anymore. That didn't make the $240,000 any less gone. It didn't make the pension sale any less real or any less time to land before I could legally object to it. And it didn't change the fact that somewhere in Tempe, a lawyer who'd put dangerous advice in writing was now trying to reach me directly, off the record, before that advice could be read out loud in front of a judge. Walter, I said, I need you to understand something clearly, because I think it matters more right now than anything else you've said. I'm not calling Daryl Hutchins back. My attorney is. And whatever he was trying to fix by reaching me first, I don't think it's going to work the way he hoped. Part 6 Patricia called me into her office 2 days later, with a tone in her voice I hadn't heard from her yet. Not alarm, something closer to focus. the sound of a person who has just found the exact tool she'd been looking for. Sarah, I need you to look at something Connie sent over this morning, because I think it changes the shape of everything we've been building. She turned her laptop toward me. Remember the pension buyout? The lump sum Walter took 11 weeks before he told Joan about the diagnosis? Connie pulled the actual buyout paperwork from the plan administrator. Look at the date on the actuarial valuation Hutchins's office submitted to justify the lump sum amount. I looked. The valuation was dated 4 months before Walter's official diagnosis date. The one Joan had given me, the one that matched his neurologist's records. I don't understand. How can a buyout justified by declining health be dated before the health was declining? That's exactly the question I want a judge to ask out loud, in open court, with Hutchins sitting right there unable to avoid answering it. Patricia leaned back. Sarah, I think what actually happened is this. Walter went to Hutchins 8 months ago, not for a divorce, but for general asset planning, maybe genuinely worried about future medical costs even before any diagnosis, the way a lot of people in their 50s start worrying. Hutchins saw an opportunity in a client with a large pension and a marriage he described as uncertain, and structured a buyout using language about declining health months before there was an actual diagnosis to point to. When the Parkinson's diagnosis came through for real, 4 months later, it became a convenient, sympathetic cover story for paperwork that had already been quietly set in motion for entirely different reasons. You think Hutchins planned this before Walter was even sick? I think Hutchins saw a vulnerable, scared man and built a structure designed to survive scrutiny, regardless of which crisis eventually justified it. Illness, divorce, retirement, anything. I've seen attorneys do this before, Sarah, fewer of them than you'd hope, but enough that I recognize the shape of it. The tragedy is that your husband's actual illness is real. The manipulation is that someone used the shape of a future illness as legal cover before that illness had even been confirmed. I sat with that for a long moment, thinking about Joan standing in my living room insisting her brother was simply scared and doing things badly, and realizing that she'd been right about the fear and wrong, or at least not fully informed, about how much of the badness had been engineered by someone else entirely. What do we do with this? We request a forensic accounting order through the court. Formal this time, not just Connie working off bank statements we gathered informally. Once it's court-ordered, the plan administrator and Hutchins's firm have to produce records they can't quietly edit or explain away after the fact. And Sarah, I want to file something else alongside it. A formal complaint to the State Bar of Arizona, referencing that discretion with spouse email and this backdated valuation together. Not because it definitely ends his career. Bar complaints take time, and I won't promise you an outcome there. But because once that complaint exists, Hutchins has to disclose it to any new client who asks. And more importantly, it puts him in a position where continuing to represent Walter aggressively against you starts to look, to a judge, exactly like a man protecting himself instead of his client. 3 days later, Daniel found one more piece, almost by accident, scrolling through his father's old email on a slow Sunday afternoon out of nothing more than restless habit. A calendar invite sent from Hutchins's office to Walter 8 months back, before any of this had a name yet. The subject line read simply, Asset Protection Strategy. Initial consultation. The body of the invite, forwarded automatically to a second address Daniel didn't recognize, CC'd someone at Hutchins & Cole Holdings, LLC, the same shell entity tied to the Mesa townhouse. Mom, why would a law firm CC its own internal holding company on a calendar invite for a client meeting? That's not normal. That's somebody tracking which clients get funneled into a structure they're already running on the side. Patricia, when I called her with this, went quiet for several seconds. The kind of quiet I'd learned by now meant she was recalculating something important. Sarah, if Hutchins & Cole Holdings LLC has been systematically funneling vulnerable clients' assets into structures the firm itself profits from, that's not just a problem for your case. That's potentially a pattern the bar would take a lot more seriously than one bad email. I need everything Daniel has today. And Sarah, I think it's time we stop reacting to whatever Hutchins does next and start deciding exactly when and how he finds out how much we already know. There's a deposition I can schedule within the next 2 weeks. I want him walking into that room with absolutely no idea that we already have the calendar invite, the backdated valuation, and the email all sitting in the same file. For the first time since the bank counter on Camelback Road, I felt something other than fear sitting in my chest. I didn't know yet exactly what that deposition would look like, or what Hutchins would say when he understood what we already had. I only knew that for 2.5 weeks, I had been the one finding out things too late to stop them. And now, for the first time, I was the one deciding when someone else would find out. Part 7. The deposition took place on a Thursday morning in a conference room on the 9th floor of a building on Camelback Road. Not far, I realized walking in from the bank where this had all started. Daryl Hutchins arrived in a gray suit, composed, his own attorney beside him, because even lawyers, it turns out, need lawyers once they become the subject of the questions instead of the one asking them. Patricia opened slowly, methodically, the way I imagined. She opened every deposition, establishing dates, establishing roles, letting Hutchins settle into the comfortable rhythm of a man answering questions he'd prepared for. Then she set the calendar invite on the table. Mr. Hutchins, can you explain why this consultation invite, sent to Walter Whitcomb 8 months ago, was copied to an address associated with Hutchins and Cole Holdings LLC? A small pause. That's an internal administrative address. Standard practice for client intake tracking. Is Hutchins and Cole Holdings LLC the same entity that owns the property on East Hartford Drive in Mesa, where a portion of Mr. Whitcomb's pension proceeds were ultimately routed? His attorney leaned in to murmur something. Hutchins's composure didn't crack exactly, but it shifted, the way a held breath shifts right before it has to come out. I'd have to review the entity's structure before confirming that. Doppy. You don't need to review it, Mr. Hutchins. You're the registered agent. Your signature is on the filing. Patricia slid the document across without raising her voice, the way I imagined she'd slid 100 documents across 100 tables over the years. I'll move on. This actuarial valuation, submitted to justify Mr. Whitcomb's pension lump sum buyout, cites declining health as the basis for the accelerated payout structure. It's dated 4 months before Mr. Whitcomb's actual Parkinson's diagnosis. Can you explain that timeline? Clients sometimes present symptoms before formal diagnosis. The valuation reflects reported health concerns at the time. Reported by whom? A longer pause this time. By the client. Mr. Whitcomb has stated, under oath in a prior interview with my office, that he had no symptoms and no health concerns at the time that valuation was submitted, and that he didn't raise any health concerns with your office until 4 months later, around the time of his actual diagnosis. So I'll ask you directly. Did your office submit a valuation citing declining health before any health decline had actually been reported to you? I watched something happen in Daryl Hutchins's face that I will remember for a long time. Not panic. Not yet. But the specific stillness of a man doing math he'd hoped never to be asked to do out loud, in a room with a court reporter typing every word of it down for a permanent record. I'd need to review my file before answering further, he said finally. And Patricia let the silence after that sentence stretch out far longer than was comfortable for anyone in the room. Because silence, I was learning, could do work that questions sometimes couldn't. She moved to the email next. Discretion with spouse pending finalization, read it aloud in full, slowly, and asked him directly whether that sentence constituted legal advice to conceal marital assets prior to a contested filing. His attorney objected. Patricia restated the question. Hutchins, after a long exchange with his own counsel in lowered voices, finally said that communication reflects standard guidance regarding the sequencing of financial decisions. It was not intended to instruct concealment. Mr. Hutchins, what would you call advice to maintain discretion with a spouse while restructuring $240,000 in marital assets, if not concealment? He didn't answer that one at all. His attorney asked for a break. During the recess, I sat in the hallway with Patricia, my hands wrapped around a paper cup of bad coffee from the building's lobby cart. And she said quietly, almost to herself, "He's going to settle this differently than he thought he would walking in here, Sarah. I can feel it. The bar complaint alone would have been bad for him." This, on the record, in his own halting non-answers. This is the kind of testimony that ends up in front of a judge whether he wants it to or not. When the deposition resumed, something had visibly changed in the room. Hutchins's attorney requested a private conference with Patricia before any further questions. The kind of request that, she told me afterward, almost always means one thing. The other side has finally understood exactly how bad their exposure actually is and wants to talk about limiting the damage before the record gets any longer. I didn't go into that conference. I sat in the hallway instead, in the same chair, the coffee gone cold in my hands, and I thought about Walter. Not the version of him sitting somewhere across town, sick and frightened and badly advised, but the version of him from 30 years ago, the one who used to drive me to my dental hygiene exams at 6 in the morning so I wouldn't be nervous waiting alone. I didn't know yet what Patricia and Hutchins's attorney were negotiating behind that door, or what it would mean for the $240,000, or the pension, or the house on Chola Street, that I still didn't fully know if I'd be able to keep. I only knew that when Patricia finally came back out, her expression carefully neutral in the way I'd come to recognize, meant she was holding something significant, and choosing exactly how to deliver it. She sat down across from me and said, "Sarah, I need to tell you what they're offering, and I need you to understand that what happens in the next 10 minutes is going to decide a lot more than just the money." Part 8. What Hutchins's attorney offered, sitting in that hallway with my cold coffee still in my hands, wasn't a number. It was a sequence of concessions, the kind Patricia later told me almost never happens unless the other side has already privately concluded they're going to lose worse in front of a judge than they're willing to lose right now, quietly, in a room with no court reporter watching. Hutchins's firm agreed not to contest a forensic accounting order covering every account, every entity, every transfer connected to Walter's pension buyout, and the $240,000. They agreed to a confidential settlement with Walter's case that effectively unwound the lump sum buyout's most aggressive terms, restoring a portion of the pension's value to the marital estate for purposes of our divorce. Not because Hutchins suddenly developed a conscience, Patricia said, but because letting that backdated valuation get read into a permanent court record was a risk his malpractice insurer was no longer willing to underwrite. And separately, quietly, his firm agreed to a payment structured to resolve, without admission of wrongdoing, the specific harm caused by routing marital funds through Hutchins and Cole Holdings LLC. It took another 9 months after that for the divorce itself to finalize. 9 months of mediation sessions in Patricia's conference room. 9 months of Walter looking older every time I saw him across that table. The Parkinson's visible now in small ways it hadn't been at the start. A slight tremor in his left hand he didn't try to hide anymore. The final settlement gave me half the marital estate as restored by the accounting order, plus a survivor benefit on what remained of his pension, plus the house on Chola Street outright, which Walter didn't fight me for, not once, not even quietly through his new attorney. I don't think it was generosity, exactly. I think by the end, he simply didn't have the strength left to fight for a house he understood. Finally, he'd already lost the right to ask me to share. Daryl Hutchins's bar complaint is still working its way through the State Bar of Arizona as I'm telling you this, slower than any of us would like, the way these things apparently always are. Patricia tells me 2 other former clients have since come forward independently, both citing eerily similar timelines, vague health concerns cited in valuations before any actual diagnosis existed, funds quietly routed through entities tied back to his own firm. Whatever happens to his license, I no longer think of it as my fight to finish. I gave the record what it needed. Somebody else's case will have to carry it the rest of the way now. I went back to work, in a way I hadn't expected to. Not at a dental practice. My hands aren't what they used to be, and 5 years away from the chairside work had cost me more than I wanted to admit. Instead, Connie Park, of all people, offered me a part-time position at her Tucson office, answering phones at first, then slowly helping organize intake files for women, walking into exactly the kind of morning I'd walked into at that Fifth Third branch on Camelback Road. I'm not a forensic accountant. I never will be. But I know, better than almost anyone Connie's ever hired, exactly what it sounds like when a woman calls and says, she just found out her account is empty, and she doesn't yet understand that the rest of her life is about to be rebuilt out of whatever's left. Renata still calls every Sunday. Daniel flew back to Denver eventually, though he calls more now than he used to. Like the whole ordeal taught him something about not waiting until a crisis to pick up the phone. Marisol came home for 2 weeks during the worst of the mediation, slept in her old room, made dinner most nights, without being asked. The way grown children sometimes quietly step back into roles you didn't know they remembered. Walter and I are not friends, exactly. We are not enemies either. He calls occasionally, mostly about Daniel and Marisol, sometimes just to ask how I'm doing, and I tell him, briefly, honestly, and then we hang up. The way you hang up with someone whose entire shape in your life has changed, but whose voice you'd still recognize anywhere, even now, even after everything. I kept Walter's reading glasses. I don't entirely know why. They sat on his side of the nightstand for 30 years, and when he finally came by to collect the last of his things from the garage, he forgot them, or maybe he didn't. Maybe some part of him left them on purpose. The way I'd once left an emerald dress hanging in a closet I no longer wanted to look at. I found them a few weeks later, cleaning out the drawer, and instead of throwing them away, I put them in a small box in the hall closet. The same box where I keep my mother's rosary and Daniel's first baby shoe and Marisol's kindergarten report card. Not because I'm sentimental about Walter exactly, but because 30 years doesn't erase itself just because the last one of them went badly. Some evenings now, I sit at that same kitchen table on Cholla Street alone, the house finally, fully mine on paper as well as in practice, and I think about that teller at the bank, the gentle, careful way she told me an account I'd trusted my whole adult life had simply stopped existing 11 days before I ever knew to ask. I think about how long it took me to understand that the account closing wasn't actually the ending of anything. It was just the first quiet sound of something underneath the floor finally giving way, the way old houses do, slowly, in places you can't see until you go looking. And how, eventually, if you go looking long enough, you find out exactly which parts were never as solid as you thought, and which ones, against everything, were still yours to keep.